That's what real devotion does. Real devotion gives itself. Devotion isn't something that anyone else can do for you. It's for you to do. Devotion is yours and yours alone. Now, everything I've just said is a very drawn-out way to say that the church is meant to be filled with real and true Christians who devote themselves to Jesus. Some of you guys would be like, no, duh. Right? Of course. That sounds simple, right? That sounds great. The challenge we have is, how do we not just be something general and theoretical, but how do we really be something that's tangible, and how do we do something in practice? There's like 85+% of people in the United States who call themselves Christians. But what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? Saying we're devoted to Christ can't just be some ethereal thing, like when you hear politicians, you know, and they talk about how, who's in for change? And everybody's like, yeah! You know? Who's in for freedom? And we're like, yeah! Freedom! And we're like, what is that, you know? What does that actually do? What does that mean? Oh, wait, I got to pay money for that? You know? Oh, never mind. You know? No, change is bad. Let's keep it the way it was. Here in Acts 2, we actually see the things that they devoted themselves to as a result of being devoted to Jesus. Right? We talked about the fact that when you're devoted to something, someone, when you have this object of devotion, it encompasses a whole lot of things. It doesn't just mean like, I'm in for Christ. Okay, let's go and do our own thing. No, there's a whole lot of working out that goes into that. Now, we read about all the things that they were devoted to, like the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, the breaking of bread, the prayer. You know, they gave to everyone as they had need. They met every day in the temple courts. They worshiped God. But the first thing I want you to notice about it is that it wasn't just something they believed, okay? Their devotion to God wasn't just some mental kind of decision that they made for Christ. Their devotion to Christ was a manifestation of what they believed put into action, and that's what the Bible tells us. James chapter 2:17 tells us, faith without action is dead. This means that if you are a Christian, and because you believe some things but don't live it, the Bible would call you a liar. Because faith and doing walk hand in hand. There's no such thing as a belief in God that saves you and yet doesn't move you, doesn't transform you, and it doesn't impact the way that you live your life. What's crazy about the early church and the early Christians is that they didn't call themselves Christians. The unbelieving world called them Christians. They looked at them and they said, these people look like Christ. What should we call them? Let's call them Christians. Because that's what Christians are. They're like Christ. Today, we run around, we call ourselves Christians, and what does the world call us? Hypocrites. And the truth is that if our words don't match up with our walk, then they're right. If the stuff we say we believe in is different from the way that we live, they're right. First thing here that devotion commands is action. Here's the second thing I want to point out about this, is that they were all in for it. They were in for all of it. Put that passage back up, Acts 2:42. I want you to look at that and just recognize and notice how many times in there it says, and, all, every, everyone, and anyone. There's a lot of that going on in there. They were devoted to all of it. Why? Because Jesus was about all of it. And Jesus was about us being about all of it. Here's Jesus, Mark 12, verse 30. You guys know it. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your mind, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. Do we see like the major word here? All. Like Christ cares about us being devoted to all of it because he was devoted to being all of it, and he wants us to be like him. Somewhere along the line in the history of the church and Christianity, we moved away from being this all kind of people to a something kind of people. We moved away from being an and people to an or people. We buy into this idea that as a follower of Jesus, it's enough for me to just be a prayer and not care about serving the poor. We believe that it's okay for me to just be about the Word of God and not care about prayer. We believe it's okay for me to be all in for community, right? But that's not what Jesus says, and that's not what the Christians in the first church did, and that's not how they lived. All of them did all of it. Crazy. Why? Because we're all students of God. We're all disciples of God. We're all students of His Word. We're all prayers. We're all missionaries. We're all community members who are called to love one another. We're all servants. We're all these things because that's what Jesus is. We're followers of Christ. We're not followers of a church. We're not followers of a religion or an idea or a gifting. We're followers of Jesus. Guess what disciples of Jesus do? They do what Jesus does. These guys devoted themselves to living like Jesus lived, talking like Jesus talked, living like He lived, walking like He walked, doing what He did. This is how they lived their life because Christ was the goal and Christ was the essence of their devotion. So they did a whole lot of stuff as a result of that. I don't want to go into a lot of that. We're going to spend a lot of the series here coming up talking about these elements. Tony talked a little bit about the apostles' teaching. But really, there was 6 things that they primarily devoted themselves to. There was some stuff God did in there, but there was things that they were committed to. They committed themselves to the Word of God. Why? Because Jesus was. Jesus was a rabbi. Jesus taught it. John 1:14 says that He is the Word. Okay? Ephesians 6, Paul tells us that the Word of God is the sword of the Spirit. He tells us to pick it up. You know what that means? That means the Word of God is like a weapon to be used in your life against the enemy that's coming after you. And here's a news flash. If you're living your life and going like, man, I'm a Christian and I don't understand why the enemy just seems to kick my butt over and over and over again, and the same temptation, the same sin and all this stuff, I got a good guess. It's because you're not devoted to the Word. You don't know it. God told us that His Word is a sword. That's for us. They devoted themselves to community. Not like a bunch of guys who like go out and drink, look for chicks, okay? Like real godly community that they were in, that they shared Christ together, that they talked about Christ, that they served together. This was like a real intimate, genuine, small group kind of community. They prayed together. Why? Because Jesus had to pray. Imagine that. I mean, does it surprise anybody that Jesus had to pray? He was God. I look at that and say, if He had to pray, what does that mean for us? Should we ever get off our knees? You know? They devoted themselves to serving. Why? Because Jesus served. Jesus said that the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give His life as a ransom for many. And then they heard Jesus say, look, no servant's greater than his master. You know what He was saying? Look, if I came to serve, guess what you've come to do? Serve. And Christians who love Jesus and who are devoted to Jesus, and churches who are serve. Because that's what Jesus does. They met together, it says, every day in the temple courts. Imagine that. Like, how many of you guys are like, man, I got to show up for church like once a week? That's like pulling teeth. Imagine if you showed up every day. That's how crazy these people were. Why did they show up? Because they were all about sharing Christ. They got together there because they got to worship Christ together. They got to hear about what Christ was doing. They got to share testimony. They got to hear His word preached. They got to serve. They got to do all this stuff together, and they were bent on Christ. They wanted all of it. And Christians who are devoted to Christ and churches who are devoted to Christ, they do church, okay? Church is not bad. Church is good. We got to love Jesus in it. They devoted themselves to worship. It says that they praised God in verse 47. They praised God. Of course they did.